Today, I'd like to talk about putting cam bearings in a small block Chevrolet. This block here happens to be a 400 cubic inch block, but your 305 and 350s will be the same. There's a lot of different opinions on the internet and YouTube on where to place the oil hole in the bearing, where to locate it in your block. I'm going to show today where I locate it, which is also the same that is recommended by a lot of your bearing manufacturers. So let's say you just bought a new set of cam bearings and you opened your box. This is what you're going to see. They're going to give you a little chart that shows the position of each bearing, and your bearings will be marked on the outside of them. Like the first one there, CH-4-1, is position number 1 in your block. Number 1 position in your block is the front of the block where the timing chain goes. CH-4-2 goes in positions 2 and 5. CH-4-3 goes in positions 3 and 4. If the camera will do it, I'll show you on a bearing where they mark them and how they stamp them on there. If I can see it here, there it is. I don't know if this will come up in the camera or not. Yeah, you can it's really hard to see, but this bearing's marked CH-4-1, and then I wrote number 1 on the bearing. One of the first things I do when I open a box is I write down, like in this bearing here, I wrote number 4 on it. I write down all my positions on the bearing 1 through 5 of where it goes. So just remember to look at your chart and then write down on the bearing, like we did with number 1, CH-4-1 goes in position number 1, which is the front of the block. So you start at the front of the block with number 1 and 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, like I said earlier, there's a lot of opinions on where to locate your oil bearing hole. Like bearing number 1 is the only bearing that will have 2 holes in it. You got 1 there and 1 there. So that will always be bearing number 1. But there's a lot of different opinions on where to locate that oil hole. In bearing number 1, a lot of your bearing manufacturers will recommend to put that hole, to put them 2 holes at 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. But when they say 10 and 2, that is with the block in the upright position. You typically install your cam bearings with your block upside down. So I made this little chart here just to show you what you can do is line up your oil holes, because when your block is upside down, 10 and 2 is now 8 o'clock and 4 o'clock. So if your oil hole is lined up at 8 and 4, then I'll take a marker right at 12 o'clock and I will draw a line on the back of the bearing, which I've already done to this one. There's my line. That tells me that's where 12 o'clock is located in reference to the oil holes in the bearing. There's the 2 oil holes, as you can see, and there's a line that I drew at 12 o'clock. So once you got them labeled 1 through 5 and you got your 12 o'clock mark, all you really have to do, it's very simple, is you line the mark that you drew on your bearing at 12 o'clock, you line up with the hole in the oil saddle for number 1. So you're going to take your bearing and your bearing driver, you're going to line that mark that you drew on the bearing, line it up with this oil hole at 12 o'clock, and knock that bearing in. Now when you knock it in, you want to make sure that your oil holes in your bearing, or there's a channel that runs around in here. Make sure that they're in that groove so that the oil can come out through the hole. Now that's bearing number 1. Remember, 8 o'clock and 4 o'clock when the block is flipped over, but when you got it upright, it's 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock. As your cam spins in a clockwise direction. And what that does is it takes the oil from 2 o'clock, draws it down to the bottom of the bearing and creates a wedge in there. It gets an oil wedge. And, it's all the pressure from your push rods and your lifter, or your push rods and valve springs, that cam's being pushed down to the bottom of the bearing. So you want a good oil wedge in there so you don't tear the bearing up. So number 1 bearing, 8 o'clock and 4 o'clock with the oil holes with the block flipped over upside down. 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock when the block's sitting upright. Now for right now, let's talk about 2, 3, and 4. Bearings 2, 3, 4, and 5, the remaining bearings only have 1 oil hole. You want to locate this hole at the 2 o'clock position with the block upright. But once again, your block is upside down. So with your block being upside down, you want to locate that hole at 8 o'clock. With the block upside down, you want the hole at 8 o'clock. So I do the same thing here with numbers 2 through 5. I line up that oil hole with my 8 o'clock mark on my paper. I draw a line on the back of the bearing, which I've already done to this one. So that tells me that's 12 o'clock. Now when I install bearings number 2 through 4, it's the same thing. I take my mark in my bearing that I drew and I line it up with the oil hole in the bearing saddle for number 2, which would be the same for number 3 and the same as number 4. Now if this camera will show it and you look in here, if you can see it in there, that's my hole in my bearing located at the 8 o'clock position because the block is upside down. That's bearing number 2. Bearing number 3, 8 o'clock position. Bearing number 4, the hole's in the 8 o'clock position. So all I did was when I took the line that I drew at 12 o'clock and I lined it up with the oil holes in the bearing saddle, which then I located the oil hole in the 8 o'clock position. Now when I flip the block over upright, that will now be 2 o'clock. But let's talk about number 5 bearing for a moment. Number 5 bearing still goes in the same 8 o'clock position with the block upside down, which will be the 2 o'clock position with the block upright. But when you're installing that bearing, you don't have an oil hole in your bearing saddle right at 12 o'clock to locate the bearing to. But if you look here in the back of the block, I don't know if this will show it or not, I really hope it does. You see that little piece of casting right there underneath the bearing saddle? That's going to be 12 o'clock. So when you're installing that bearing, you line that, the mark that you drew on your bearing, you line it up with that, and you're gonna be good. So let's just go over that again. Bearing number 1, 8 o'clock and 4 o'clock. 2, 3, 4, and 5. Number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5 are all in the 8 o'clock position with the block flipped upside down. Once the block is sitting upright, then you are 10 and 2 on the front and 2 o'clock position on bearings 2, 3, 4, and 5. Which, like I said earlier, that creates an oil wedge at the bottom of the bearing because your cam spins clockwise. The oil comes out at 2 o'clock and it gets pulled down to the bottom of the bearing and you don't tear the bearing up. I hope that you've picked up something from this video, and another thing I forgot to mention was keeping everything clean. That when you open your bearing box, spray your bearings with some brake cleaner and wipe them clean or blow them clean. Make sure that the bores in your block are clean. And after I knock my bearings in, like these two bearings I were using or showing you are actually a used set of bearings that I took out of another motor. You see all the marks on the OD of them? That's from them being installed into the block. You'll end up with little shavings in your block there. Now I install these dry with no oil. I don't put oil on nothing. I install these dry. But after I knock these bearings in, I take air and I blow air through there to blow any chips out that may have shaved off the bearing as I was installing it. I can't emphasize enough that you got to have all this clean, or things ain't going to work right for you. And another thing that I do once I got the bearings put in, before I freeze plug it and put the oil plugs in and all that stuff, is I have a camshaft that I use strictly as a test cam. I install it in there to make sure everything fits and the bearings aren't cocked or they're not sized right. If the cam goes in and I can spin it freely by hand, then I know my bearings are installed right. Like I said earlier, there's a lot of information out there on installing Chevy cam bearings, and there's a lot of different opinions. With the block upside down, install number 1 bearing oil holes at 8 and 4, and 2 through 5, install them at 8 with your block upside down. Then when you flip it over, you'll be sitting at 2 o'clock, which is what most bearing manufacturers recommend. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'm hoping to make more in the future. If you have any questions about anything, please leave it in the comments section. And if you would like to, please subscribe to my channel, and I would love to make more videos for people. Thanks for watching.